There's a moment you've experienced, but probably never named. You're alone, reviewing something you just completed, an email, a presentation, a piece of work you spend hours on, and suddenly a voice emerges. Not heard exactly, more like a presence that's always been there, waiting for vulnerability. The voice doesn't congratulate, it catalogs. It finds the awkward phrasing, the imperfect detail, the moment where you almost faltered. And it tells you with absolute certainty that this reveals something true about you, that you're not quite adequate, not quite sufficient, that you scraped by this time, but the gap between what you managed and what you should have produced is undeniable. Most people assume this voice is motivation, a helpful reminder not to slack. But there's something else happening beneath that story. The voice isn't encouraging you toward better, it's protecting you from something worse. It arrived early in your life, whispered in the particular context of your family, your school, the way you learned about safety and survival, and it has never left. The inner critic operates across almost every domain of human experience, but it becomes visible most clearly in specific moments. When you're about to try something new and hesitate, sensing that exposure might reveal inadequacy. When someone offers praise and you immediately discount it, constructing reasons why their assessment is mistaken or generous or based on incomplete information. When you notice yourself working late on something already finished, tweaking minor details, unable to release it into the world. When you scroll through your day and catalog failures, not the objectively significant ones, but the small fumbles, the conversational moments where you said something imperfect, the instance where your attention wandered and you weren't fully present. The critic holds these like evidence in a case it's building. The case is about you, and the conclusion is always the same. You're running a deficit. This isn't unique to high achievers or anxious temperaments, though those populations often report it with particular intensity. It appears in the stay-at-home parent who reviews parenting decisions and finds them wanting. It appears in the creative person who hides their work because the standard in their mind is so radically divorced from what they can actually produce that showing it feels like declaring bankruptcy of talent. It appears in the middle-aged person who quietly believes they've made structural mistakes that cannot be repaired, that they chose wrong somewhere and are now living the consequences rather than living an actual life. The inner critic emerges from an adaptive logic, though the logic has become so naturalized that we experience it as truth rather than strategy. In childhood, you inhabited an environment where approval mattered for survival, not just emotionally, though that too, literally and figuratively. The parent or caregiver held resources, food, shelter, safety, attention. Their satisfaction or dissatisfaction was information about whether you were aligned with their expectations. Some children learned that excellence was the primary currency of approval, that demonstrating competence was how you proved your worth and earned your place. Others learned that invisibility was safer, that drawing attention invited scrutiny and correction, so you became expert at not disrupting the family system. Still others learned that vulnerability was dangerous, that admitting confusion or need was met with contempt or withdrawal. So you developed an early self-sufficiency that was really just self-abandonment wearing functional clothing. Whatever the specific context, the psyche drew conclusions. It noticed patterns, it adapted. And the inner critic emerged as one of several protective mechanisms designed to keep you ahead of judgment, to catch the mistake before someone else does, to notice the insufficiency before you're publicly exposed, to maintain constant vigilance so that the worst-case scenario never arrives unannounced. This is where Jungian psychology offers a crucial clarification. The inner critic is not the shadow itself. It's trying to protect you from the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, contains all the material you've disowned, the emotions deemed too intense, the desires labeled selfish, the qualities that didn't fit the acceptable image of who you should be. If you grew up in a family where anger was dangerous, your capacity for healthy assertion entered the shadow. If you learned that ambition was greedy, your drive for achievement went underground. If you internalize the message that emotional intensity equals instability or unreliability, your range of feeling contracted and everything else went into the repository of disowned material. The inner critic's job is to keep those disowned parts buried. It does this through constant surveillance of behavior, through the logic that if you can catch yourself before you become wrong, before you embody the qualities you fear most, then you're safe. The critic is a gatekeeper. It's hostile, yes, but its hostility is aimed at protecting you from what you believe would be catastrophic. The problem with this protection is that it doesn't actually protect. It constrains. The energy required to maintain constant vigilance, to catch every imperfection, to never quite rest because rest might mean exposure, that energy is finite, and it's being applied to the wrong targets. The critic isn't keeping you safe from external judgment as much as it's keeping you imprisoned within an increasingly narrow range of acceptable self-expression. You become someone who can only be the competent version, or only the humble version, or only the independent version. Never the full complexity of human experience that includes all these dimensions moving together. When you're identified with just one pole and the critic is enforcing it relentlessly, you're actually more vulnerable to disruption, not less. Because the moment circumstances shift and you're no longer able to maintain that narrow performance, the system collapses. The person whose entire identity rests on competence begins to fragment when they make a significant error. The person who built themselves around invisible functionality becomes invisible to themselves too. The integration doesn't happen. The inner critic also creates a particular kind of internal dissonance that leaks into external relationships. When you're constantly running an internal case against yourself, you're practicing a particular kind of relationship to others, skeptical, defensive, waiting for the judgment you believe is coming. This creates a feedback loop in how you interact. People sense your preemptive defense and sometimes mirror it back. Or they sense your internal narrative of insufficiency and begin treating you according to that story, not because they're cruel, but because we all unconsciously respond to the narratives others are broadcasting. A woman who carries deep internal skepticism about her own competence often finds herself in professional settings where her contributions are overlooked, not because they lack quality, but because she presents them with barely concealed doubt, and others unconsciously take her cue. A person who believes they're fundamentally unlovable finds evidence everywhere. A delayed text is proof, a declined invitation confirms it, someone's need for alone time is interpreted as rejection. The inner critic isn't just an internal phenomenon, it's a social structure, and it trains everyone around you to participate in the architecture of your self-doubt. The texture of inner criticism varies. Some versions are overtly harsh, using language that would be shocking if spoken aloud by another person. This version is easier to recognize because its antagonism is undisguised. It sounds like the critical parent, the dismissive teacher, the voice that said, "You always mess this up," or "You should know better by now." Other versions are more insidious because they're dressed in rationality. This version doesn't attack so much as it corrects. It frames itself as helpful. Of course people were disappointed. You came across as needy. That's just factual observation. Or, you're going to hurt yourself if you keep raising your expectations like this. I'm just being realistic. This rationalized version often survives longer because it's harder to dispute. It sounds like truth. It sounds like growth. It sounds like the part of you that actually cares about your development. But the effect is the same. You never fully trust yourself, never fully relax, never fully celebrate anything without immediately contextualizing it against some higher standard that remains permanently out of reach. Understanding the origins doesn't immediately dissolve the critic's voice, but it changes the relationship to it. The first shift is recognizing that the critic isn't you. This is more complex than it sounds because the critic has occupied so much of your mental space for so long that it feels like your essential nature. But there's a crucial distinction between the voice and the self. The voice represents a strategy, an adaptation to an earlier environment. The self is larger. The voice represents a protective function, not the totality of what you are. This distinction becomes real through direct engagement with the critic itself, not arguing with it or trying to silence it, but speaking to it with curiosity. In a quiet moment, you can ask the critic directly, "What are you trying to protect me from?" The question might seem strange, even absurd, but the answer that emerges often contains unexpected wisdom. The one that's been telling you that you're not competent enough often reveals that it's terrified of exposure, of being seen as fraudulent. The one that relentlessly catalogs your social failures is often terrified that isolation will be the result of authenticity. The one that insists you're never doing enough often emerged in an environment where scarcity of approval, of resources, of safety was real. These protective functions made sense somewhere. They were adaptive. They helped you survive. The work isn't to destroy them, but to update the operating context. One way to begin this updating is through structured journaling that isolates the trigger, the meaning-making, and the integration. When you notice the critic is particularly active, perhaps you've made a mistake, or you're about to attempt something vulnerable, or you've received feedback that didn't align with your hopes, you can pause and document what's actually happening. Write down the specific situation without judgment. What occurred? What did you do or not do? Then write down what the critic is saying about what it means. Not what you think, but what the voice is claiming. This is diagnosis. You're making the unconscious narrative. Then comes the crucial move. You ask a counter-hypothesis. What if this situation doesn't mean what the critic claims? What if the mistake doesn't reveal fundamental inadequacy, but just reveals you're human and trying? What if the vulnerability doesn't indicate you're weak, but indicates you're brave? This isn't positive thinking or denial. It's generating alternative meaning-making, because meaning isn't inherent in events. It's constructed by the observer. The critic has been constructing it from one perspective for years. You're creating space for other perspectives. Then you choose one small, concrete action that embodies the alternative meaning. If the critic said your social awkwardness reveals that you don't belong, and you've hypothesized instead that it reveals you're still learning to be authentic, the action might be reaching out to someone you've been distant from and admitting something true. Or it might be something smaller, speaking one honest thing in a meeting where you'd normally stay invisible. The action doesn't have to be dramatic. It has to be sufficient to create a small piece of evidence that the alternative meaning is also possible. Another intervention involves what might be called safe imaginative dialogue. This works by creating an internal container where you can have a conversation with the critic as though it were a separate entity. This requires finding a quiet physical space and allowing yourself to sit with the critic's presence without trying to change it immediately. You might imagine it as a younger version of yourself, or as a symbolic figure, or simply as an energy you can sense. Then you ask it questions. What do you need me to know? What are you most afraid will happen if I stop listening to you? What good things might happen if I learn to trust myself more? This might sound absurd if you're not familiar with this kind of work, but what often emerges in this dialogue is that the critic has been operating in isolation for so long that it doesn't know it's outdated. It doesn't know you're an adult now with more resources than you had as a child. It doesn't know that some of the dangers it was protecting you from no longer exist in quite the same form. The dialogue creates connection rather than battle. After the internal conversation, you honor what the critic was protecting by doing one small thing that acknowledges the protective impulse while moving forward anyway. If the critic emerged from a context where visibility brought punishment, you might wear something slightly more bold than usual or speak up once in a group setting. If it emerged from scarcity, you might allow yourself a small indulgence without guilt. If it emerged from a context where failure was intolerable, you might attempt something where you're likely to be clumsy and do it anyway. These actions are small symbolic statements. I'm acknowledging your concern, and I'm living anyway. The third dimension involves boundary setting with language, paired with genuine self-audit. The critic often gets active in social interactions precisely because social interaction contains unpredictability. You can't control how someone will respond to you. This uncertainty activates the critic. One way to interrupt this is through learning to use brief, non-defensive boundary phrases. Instead of elaborate explanations or justifications for your choices, you practice simple statements. That doesn't work for me. I understand your perspective and I'm going a different direction. I appreciate the input and I'm going to take some time with this. These phrases are remarkable because they're complete without qualification. They don't require you to manage the other person's reaction or to defend yourself. But they activate something in you that's uncomfortable, the sense that you might disappoint someone, that you might not be received as you hoped. After using these boundaries, the self-audit is essential. You notice what you felt physically: tightness, heat, the urge to soften the boundary or apologize. You notice what the other person did. Did they withdraw, escalate, accept it? You notice whether your impulse is to rigidly maintain the boundary or to quickly collapse it. This audit is gathering evidence about your actual patterns. Over time, as you use boundaries repeatedly and survive the discomfort and the other person survives not getting what they wanted, you gather evidence that contradicts the critic's core narrative. You learn that disappointing someone doesn't destroy the relationship. You learn that boundaries sometimes invite respect rather than punishment. You learn that you can be disagreed with and still be okay. The fourth practice involves 3 small, regular actions: scheduled solitude without distraction, 1 honest refusal where you normally say yes, and 1 moment of genuine connection. The scheduled solitude is important because the constant external input, podcasts, social media, music, news, keeps you from encountering your own internal material. It keeps the critic from being fully felt and metabolized. When you sit in silence, the disowned material has space to emerge. You might feel sadness that's been underground. You might feel desire you've been suppressing. You might feel anger at the constraints you've been accepting. This isn't pleasant, but it's necessary. These feelings are part of the shadow material, the disowned self. When you have space to feel them without immediately trying to fix or transcend them, something shifts. The critic loses some of its power because the very thing it's been protecting you from, your full internal experience, you're learning to tolerate. The honest refusal is the moment where you decline something you'd normally accept out of obligation or fear. It doesn't have to be something major. It can be declining a social invitation, refusing to take on an extra project, saying no to a favor you'd normally automatically grant. The critic will be active during this refusal. It will tell you that you're being selfish, that you're going to regret this, that the other person will think less of you. And you do it anyway. You survive. The moment of genuine connection is when you briefly drop the performance and contact another person as you actually are. You admit uncertainty where you'd normally project confidence. You share a real feeling instead of a curated update. You ask for help with something small instead of managing it in isolation. These moments train a different relationship to other people. They prove that your actual self is tolerable, is sometimes even more connecting than the defended version. What happens as these practices accumulate, and they need to accumulate, need to repeat, need to become the ordinary texture of your life, is that a differentiation begins to emerge. You start recognizing that there are roles you play, personas you inhabit that are functional and necessary. You can be the professional in a meeting and fully inhabit that role while knowing it's a deliberate choice, not the totality of who you are. You can be the supportive friend without losing track of your own needs. You can be competent and also be uncertain. You can be responsible and also rest. The roles become tools you use rather than cages you're trapped within. The critic becomes one voice among many rather than the sovereign authority. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming more fully yourself beneath and beyond the layers of adaptation and protection you've constructed. It's not about transcendence or perfection. It's about integration, about acknowledging that the critic emerged for a reason, that it was trying to help, and that you're large enough now to hold its protective impulse while also holding your actual complexity. The result isn't the elimination of standards or the disappearance of healthy self-reflection. Real growth doesn't happen without some internal feedback about where you're living inauthentically or where your actions don't align with your values. But there's a crucial difference between constructive self-assessment and the critic's endless cataloging of insufficiency. One asks, where is this not working, and what would authenticity look like here? The other asks, what have I done wrong, and what does it reveal about my fundamental inadequacy? One is oriented toward becoming, the other is oriented toward proving. The critic, as long as it's operating unchecked, keeps you in the proving mode, and proving never ends. Because the standard the critic is enforcing isn't rational or achievable. It's the standard of never failing, never disappointing, never being exposed as not quite enough. No human can meet that, so the critic keeps working, keeps vigilant, keeps you running a deficit. The alternative is accepting that you are, right now, sufficient. Not in the sense of I'm perfect and need no growth, but in the sense of I'm a whole person with legitimate needs and legitimate contributions, and I'm allowed to take up space and to be imperfect while I'm here. This isn't arrogance. It's the opposite of what the critic told you it was. It's the most grounded, realistic assessment available. You exist. That's enough. Everything else is development, not justification.